Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the Victoria Forum. I'm Saul Klein, the Chair of the Victoria Forum and the Dean of the Gustafson School of Business here at the University of Victoria. Before I begin, I'd like to remind you that I'm coming to you from the University of Victoria and acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I also ask you to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on today as we engage in our discussions. Adele?
Okay, I am Adel Gitouni. I am the Associate Co-Chair of the Victoria Forum. Welcome to, bienvenue à ce résumé du Forum de Victoria. Nous reconnaissons avec respect le territoire traditionnel des peuples de la langue Lekwungen, sur lequel se trouve l'université, et les peuples Songhees, Esquimalt et Wasanich, dont les relations historiques avec la Terre se poursuivent encore aujourd'hui.
Okay, thank you, Adele. And again, thank you all for coming. We've had a really interesting couple of days last week, covering a very broad spectrum of activities. The virtual forum allowed us to generate a very strong global audience. As I mentioned at the outset, we have participants from more than 50 countries, and we had people registering, say, from those countries. In total, almost 1,500 people have registered for these discussions. Now, I realize that not everybody was able to attend all sessions. Obviously, we had several of them running concurrently. Have I just lost the connection? Oh, sorry. I'm not sure if I lost you. My screen just went blank for a second. As I was saying, I realized that you wouldn't have been able to attend all of the sessions because we had so many concurrent ones. And I'd like to remind you that we did record all of the sessions, and they will be made available very soon. Sorry. Are you hearing me? Because I'm not seeing my picture come up on the main view screen.
Yes.
Oh, okay. As far as the forum itself goes, we had three cross-cutting themes, as you're aware, looking at trying to bridge the divides from economic, social, and environmental standpoints. It became very clear over our discussions that those three divides were inextricably linked, and it was very difficult to sort out what was going on. The drivers of one divide were actually accentuating some of the difficulties in the others. But having that crossover on the theme has been really important.
Audio is fine. Yeah, keep going.
Okay. If we look at the structure of the forums, they were organized broadly, and we'll report back on them today around those three themes. But in doing so, we're looking both at the immediate effects of the pandemic, but also more broadly at the divides that existed before the pandemic and continue to exist. And what we're really trying to get at is a search for solutions to those divides. What made many of the sessions come to life, beyond that broader discussion, is that our meeting last week is very much in the shadow of the US elections. And there was a lot of discussion over the last week looking at what that means for different regions, but also more broadly about the nature of divides in the world today. We also had a strong focus on learning from Indigenous knowledge that ran through the session. So the plan for this morning is to call on the various champions of the different sessions to give a very short summary and then talk about what some of the recommendations were coming out of those sessions. So that's the agenda. Let me start, and we'll begin with the opening plenary of Bridging Divides in the Wake of a Global Pandemic, which set the stage for the rest of the forum. We had three very powerful speakers: President Adesina from the African Development Bank, the Honorable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and Ms. Hakima El Haite, who's President of the Liberal International. Lord Alderdice summarized the discussion at the end of that session And I'd like to call on him to give us some reflections and comments coming out of that session and some directions for the rest of today. Lord Alderdice.
Well, first of all, congratulations, Saul and Adele, and indeed the host of colleagues at the University of Victoria, who over many months put together such an impressive event, entirely justifying the decision to go ahead despite the pandemic, but of course to do so online. At the start, Saul introduced Dr. Skip Dick, representing the Indigenous people of the area, and then he introduced the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, the Honourable Janet Austin, the Speaker of the Senate of Canada, the Honourable George Fury, Her Worship Lisa Phelps, the Mayor of the City of Victoria, and Kevin Hall, the President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Victoria. A very impressive lineup for the start of a very impressive event. The introduction by Dr. Skip Dick reminded me not only of the importance of recognising those who lived in the territory long before the Europeans came, but also of the way in which Indigenous people the world over regularly expressed their respect for those who came before the current generation, their ancestors. There's been a tendency for recent generations in the West to disregard or even disrespect those who came before, regarding them as foolish, unenlightened, lacking the knowledge and the technology possessed by the current generation. Of course, if we treat previous generations in this way, then probably so will future generations treat us. We sometimes forget that it was not the actions of our distant ancestors, but of very recent generations that have led to the threats to the future of human civilization from climate change and, one we sometimes forget about, potential nuclear catastrophe. Nala Ayadov managed the panel session very deftly and professionally, and that was not easy because the panelists were very passionate about the issues they were addressing. Akinwumi Adesina, the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, and Her Excellency Hakima Al-Haiti showed an understanding of and a genuine concern about environmental sustainability, and also set out with unmistakable clarity how we must not allow the apparently relentless widening of the educational, social and economic divides that we have seen in recent decades to continue. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated many technological and social changes, and some have been to our advantage, including the possibility of being in touch with each other online, like this. But others, of course, have been disastrous, particularly the deepening divide on educational, social and economic grounds. Perhaps you will understand some of the passion, for example, which my colleague Hakima El-Haiti spoke about these issues, when you learn that one of her family members died just before the virtual Victoria Forum, and a second, a brother, died the following day, the day after she spoke online. While the Victoria Forum has grown out of the work of the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria, the issues we have been addressing are not merely academic or technical or economic. They are profoundly human challenges, and we must not forget that. Thinking again about the introductory words from Dr. Skip Dick, I was reminded of the words of Dr. Jonas Salk. We're all concentrating on people producing vaccines, and he changed the world when he used his scientific skill and understanding to develop the first safe and effective polio vaccine, saving countless lives. Dr. Salk's injunction to us all is a sobering but inspiring one, and I will leave it with you. He said, "Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors." Each time we hear Indigenous people speak of their traditional lands, places made sacred as the home of their ancestors, let us remember our own ancestors, but silently commit ourselves to doing all that we can to become good ancestors to those who follow us.
Great. Thank you very much, Lord Alderdice. This very much sets the stage. Let me now turn to the second plenary session on the second day, because that again was an important opportunity to frame the discussion going forward. So the second plenary was entitled Constructing a Different and Inclusive Development Paradigm in Response to COVID-19, the search for transformative solutions. Let me turn to the champion for that session, Peter Taylor, to report back on that one. Peter?
Thank you very much, Saul. And again, as we've just heard, it was a real privilege to participate in the Victoria Forum and in this particular plenary. And we had excellent speakers, Mary McCarthy of Irish Aid, Rachel Sabates-Wheeler and Sohaila Nazneen from the Institute of Development Studies, and Manuel Banning from McGill University. And we had a wonderful discussant in the shape of Khalil Sharif, who did the very excellent job of bringing together a set of complex ideas, topped off with a really inspiring and, I must say, thought-provoking summary and conclusions by Lord Jack McConnell. So my thanks go to the speakers. In terms of what we learned, COVID-19 is really shining a spotlight, bringing into sharp relief a range of fissures, cracks, and marginalizations in societies throughout the world. And although it's often characterized as a health crisis, it is in fact multidimensional. And the plenary panel, via the speakers' excellent presentations, shone its own spotlight on the implications of COVID-19 for food systems, social protection, gender equality, and governance of the economy and financial systems. And our discussant, Khalil Sharif, highlighted that the pandemic is at times stalling or even reversing important progress made in recent years. For example, gender equality and social protection provision. But it's also accelerating certain challenges, for example, poverty, inequalities fueled by corruption and abuses of power, and also the rise of nationalism and populism. And these challenges are universal, they're felt everywhere, but those in lower middle income countries are suffering the most, and they're also suffering differentially, whether because of gender, age, or poverty. So what actions are needed? Firstly, to respond with urgency to the crisis, especially addressing the needs of those who are most vulnerable and in the greatest danger of being left behind. Secondly, to take a multi-pronged approach to addressing challenges around food, social protection, gender equality, and governance. And we need to combine immediate responses to vulnerabilities whilst also looking to the future and investing in long-term transformations. Thirdly, we need to challenge complacency boldly. We discussed that fundamental sustainable change is only possible within systems that embrace democracy, transparency, the independent rule of law, and fundamental equalities, including gender equality. Fourthly, we need to help people be better prepared for the future. To be able to address new and different shocks, which we think are almost inevitable, we must put equality, sustainability, and resilience of systems and communities at the center of our strategy to leave no one behind. Multilateralism is hugely important. The SDGs provide a guiding star and a catalyzing force to help us to do this. Actually, as we've been reminded by the Canadian-led UN research roadmap for the COVID recovery, which was published this week. And finally, we need to work together, joining up our efforts and collaborating to transform development, economies, communities, and people's lives. But to do so, we also need to transform ourselves and our institutions. The panelists reminded us that this is a long-term mission. We all need to stick at it, including those in positions of authority and responsibility, if we are to build forward a different world. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And again, as we heard from both plenaries, we were able to get an incredibly broad and far-ranging agenda for the need for change and some directions for where we need to go. The rest of the program was based on a series of roundtables, trying to pick up various of the threads that were begun during the plenaries. The first couple I'd like to start with are looking at particular audiences or particular demographics that are affected by the pandemic. And let me start with the one on affecting youth, bridging social divides, navigating an uncertain future for youth as workers and citizens. Crystal Tremblay is the champion for this one. Crystal?
Thanks, Saul. Good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. It was a pleasure to host our roundtable, as Saul mentioned, navigating an uncertain future for youth as workers and citizens. I'd like to thank our key speakers, Zara Chaudhry, Sage Lacerte, and Nikita Rakiani, and each of the participants that contributed. So I'm just going to share a few reflections and then point to 5 recommendations that we came up with. Youth are dealing with persistent climate anxiety and equal paralysis with climate change, unstable socioeconomic status, instability in housing and healthcare, mental health, and minority disenfranchisement. These challenges are not new, but have been significantly exacerbated since COVID-19. Youth, and especially BIPOC youth, are at the forefront of activism and experiencing racism and discrimination at school and places of work. There needs to be a focus on building a whole family wellness plan, understanding that well-being has to come from within the home and supported by the environment where people are at. We are treating symptoms, not the root of these crises, of what we are framing as crises of opportunity, stability, protection, and citizenship. These issues are interwoven and interconnected and need to be addressed as such. We must move past the shallow level of depth many conversations seem to go when addressing youth. We must truly understand what was so eloquently framed by one of our key speakers, Sarah Chaudhry, of what you do for us without us is not for us. Youth, like many other community, know their issues and needs best. We need a systematic shift to cultivate a society where youth are supported and empowered to recognize their autonomy and agency. I'd like to propose 5 recommendations. Create space for youth to lead and participate in democracy. Youth and young leaders need to be in positions of power, not simply the beneficiaries of services. Create youth-building policies with feedback mechanisms for authentic participation. Youth have active stakes in all aspects of governance. We need to include youth voices in all levels of participation if we're serious about agency. COVID-19 is not gender neutral. Economic downturn and social isolation are increasing gender-based violence for youth, BIPOC women, and LGBTQ2S. We need to urgently address this crisis. Financial support for youth and BIPOC women in particular to fully participate in the economy. We need to create innovation that recognizes those strengths and build on them. And lastly, networking opportunities. There's often no pathway for youth. We need to expand networking opportunities for youth to build community and further opportunities. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Crystal. As I indicated, the impact of the pandemic, as we've heard from many speakers, has been across multiple demographic segments, but it's been very clear that the pandemic has had greater impact on some than others. We're also coming to you with the Victoria Forum at a time when issues of systemic racism have reemerged and come to the forefront. It's not that they weren't there before, it's just they've been highlighted at the time of the pandemic. So we'd now like to talk, to hear from Ruth Mojid, the champion for the session on civic leadership, citizenship, and participatory democracy, lessons from a global response to systemic racism. Ruth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Saul. As Saul mentioned, for our session, we're really looking at some of the existing challenges that have been further exacerbated by the pandemic, especially with particularly impacted groups. For our session, we had Caroline Hilton, who was the CEO of Indigenomics, and she was really bringing some rounded perspectives on economic imperatives for shifting, for moving the dial. We also had, speaking from the political front, we had Samantha Perlman. Samantha is the first, the youngest council member to have been elected in the city of Massachusetts. And she was coming from that political point of view. We also had Rochelle Prasad, she's the founder and executive director of Spark Foundation. And she was speaking as a youth and talking about some of the many ways that youth are getting more involved in civic action. And we, as I mentioned, looked at intersectional challenges in the wake of the US elections and the results that came with. We talked about how that, I mean, everyone knowing that hasn't come to solve all of the problems. It's just, to a very large extent, it's just some efforts in the right direction. And then we're looking at imperatives now for women and implication for women in politics and leadership. We're looking at how youth still are organizing to to move the needle on pressing issues within their own communities. We also looked very deeply at the issue of economic isolation for Indigenous people. So there was quite a bit of naming the problem that we did, but we also tried to move from that to look at some of the ways that we can change the narrative. And in terms of recommendations, we heard things around we need to stop measuring socioeconomic gaps and start measuring strength instead. There was quite a bit of focus on data, being able to not just collect the data, but also ensure that we're disaggregating them. So that way we know who's impacted within what social stratification, and also we were able to identify how do we move forward together. There's also the need to start looking at one of the critical questions that we try to answer was, is democracy working for us? And traditional institutions, have they, in this time, proven to be just unreliable? And one of the key imperatives that we landed on was on the need to look at go back to Indigenous worldviews on democracy and Indigenous ways of leading and doing interactions across board, whether it's economic, social, or political. We also saw the pandemic as a whole as an opportunity to redesign our engagement with the economy, with democracy, with social organizing. We saw the need to shift power structures to ensure that historically excluded groups are being represented and new voices are emerging to the forefront. We talked about the need to rethink money, meaning, and metrics. Again, going back to the data problem, being able to first identify where they are, but also being able to unpack all of that. We talked about one of the quotes that really stood out, and this was from Rochelle Prasad, who was speaking on behalf of youth, mostly racialized youth who were particularly impacted by the pandemic. It's talking about in rethinking change in systems change, we need to consider the fact that age really doesn't matter when making a difference. And so talking about leadership and representation, we've got to shift our mindset of what that looks like. Another quote that came up quite strongly was around the need for leadership to be considered as a shared responsibility and as horizontal. First, we've got to be able to invite people to the table, including people who before now have not been part of those conversations, and ensure that we're starting from a level playing field so that everyone's voices and lived experiences are represented.
Great. Thanks very much, Ruth. That was fascinating. And picking up at least on the Indigenous theme that Lord Elderdice began with, we had a session on bridging social divides, decolonizing knowledge for transformation. So let me come back to Peter Taylor and ask him to comment on that one.
Thanks, Sol. And I just also want to give a shout out to my co-lead, Crystal Tremblay from University of Victoria, who we worked together very closely on this roundtable, also the roundtable on youth. But Crystal also gave a great contribution introducing the second plenary as well. So I just want to acknowledge her enormous contribution. And we had three great speakers in this roundtable on decolonizing knowledge for transformation: Catherine Toure and Martha Mutisi, both from the International Development Research Centre based in Nairobi, Kenya, and also Paul Lassert from Raven Capital Partners in Victoria, BC. So what did we learn? Well, although the knowledge needed to address many of our biggest challenges often exists already, we're not yet ready to recognize it or to acknowledge its value because of where it resides and who has generated it. And there are multiple knowledge systems and no one way of knowing. Knowledge systems become more effective when they acknowledge, respect, and engage in participatory, inclusive ways with Indigenous and local knowledge systems. To decolonize knowledge, we must recognize people as knowers of their experience. And we know that strong narratives are shaped by multiple perspectives and different forms and expressions of knowledge. And we have to invest in that knowledge. It needs a strong financial, economic base, which allows it to grow. But we need also to unpack and unlearn what we've learned about who we are, the power and privilege we hold, and our ideas and practices of leadership. We need to break down barriers and walls between us if we're serious about change. and we need to invoke and experience connection and belonging on this shared journey. And I must just say that this particular roundtable was really marked by, I think, a connection of intellectual contribution, but also some really heartfelt contributions and some strong emotional connection to many of the participants who participated in the discussion. And we came up with a number of actions that we'd like to share. So the first is to ensure that solutions are shaped and created by those who experience the challenges they aim to address if they are to succeed and to be sustained. Second, to establish reflective spaces for inclusive processes in which participants are aware of and interrogate their privilege and how they use it to make change. And where possible, to try to do this outside colonial spaces such as schools and check and challenge policies and practices that discriminate. There's also a personal responsibility. We need to ask ourselves, am I okay with the status quo and am I part of the problem? We need to personally stand up and do work on this ourselves as individuals, within our communities and within our organizations. Fourthly, we need to find connections and ways in which we belong with each other as communities on this shared journey towards transformation. Fifth, to appreciate that the benefits of decolonizing knowledge are just simply not obvious to everyone, nor are they desired by those who may believe they might lose their privilege. So we need to demonstrate through sharing evidence and experience the value of decolonized knowledge for liberation and a more positive future for all. And sixth, we need to bring some resources that are really needed. Patience, humility, and time, which allows for unlearning and discomfort. Transparency about how far we live and model diversity and inclusion. Courage to interrogate our own privilege and use that to make change. Shared power, be ready to give up what we hold individually and realize that the outcomes ultimately will be positive for all. Recognition of people as knowers of their own experience, and crucially, financial investment where needed. To decolonize knowledge, we also need to decolonize wealth. And finally, to work with a sense of urgency. We need to act on this now, together, if we're serious about building forward differently. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Over the course of the forum, we also had several discussions about democracy and the ability of democratic systems and institutions to solve the problems that we're facing. We have two in particular. One was on can democracy work to solve humanity's critical problems, and another on democracy in decline, emissions in ascent, signposts for the future in the post-election period. Both of those were co-championed by Christy Fasser and Thomas Homer-Dixon. Christy, do you want to kind of talk about both of those sessions, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Saul. So as mentioned, we were interested in our theme on the issues of, how democracy and everything that comes with democracy really serves us as a society when it comes to wicked problems or complex social problems, especially the one of climate change. And so we had two different sessions with two sets of really excellent speakers. But what was really nice about the two of them is that I think they worked hand in hand. And so I'll touch on both of those in my feedback now. For the session, which looked very much at the democratic project and systems of democracy, we had the excellent speakers of Jack Goldstone from George Mason University, Jennifer Welsh from McGill, Mayor Lisa Helps in local government, the mayor of the city of Victoria here locally, and my co-chair Thomas Homer-Dixon. And what they really drew on for their discussion were their own kind of histories and experience in international relations, in conflict and complexity theory, and of course in local politics and local government. And for the second session, which focused a little bit more narrowly, but quite frankly, the conversation was very wide-ranging. We had another set of eminent speakers, including Richard Florizone, who's the president and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, as well as the chair of the recent Task Force on Resilient Recovery for Canada. Gretchen Goldstone, research director for the Union of Concerned Scientists in the US. Salim Fakir, who is the CEO of the very recently established African Climate Foundation, and Ted Parson of the University of California, Los Angeles. And across these two sessions, we really discussed that the democratic project is really one that is messy and complex, and it's not something that, you know, when flailing can be fixed by any single action. And where we're seeing a decline in democracy, we're also seeing a decline in trust in the state and in state institutions. And when you have that, you know, while we might think that there is opportunities in places where there's stronger democracies, that those islands of democracy are also faced with a whole host of difficult problems on the international stage in protecting those ideals. And also in foreign policy making, and the speakers in the session really hinted at a new social contract around democracy and around some of those things that we look for. So, but when you apply it to the question of climate, you can think about democracy as having, you know, 4 key characteristics that really frustrate the policy making process and the solution making processes. It's global. It's slow, it's uncertain, and it involves no clear or single adversary. And this really makes for, like I said, a very frustrated process of finding solutions and implementing those in any timely and decisive way. So on this very high level, the recommendations that were come up with was really to think about democracy and to think about creative ways in which we can constantly renew our commitment to democracy and the collective responsibilities for that. And so you might think about examples such as participation in national service, or there was some dialogue in the plenary about something akin to a citizenship ceremony that you might participate in each time you renew your driver's license. You know, so making sure that people really feel like and understand the value of their own role in the democratic project and in the democratic system in which they participate. There was also a highlight on the importance of deliberative dialogue and recognizing and seeking to address power differentials in local and other decision-making processes, and most importantly, to really look for and find those feedback loops in complex systems that really drive resurgence and renewal of the democratic ideals that we strive for. So now focusing a little bit more on the issue of climate change, the speakers in the session on climate change really spoke to the greater need and role for scientists to act as responsible advocates, and particularly for scientists to step up and really re-strengthen states based on expertise and empirical evidence. And that's something that we're seeing more and more, but is a bit of a shift in the historical role for scientists. There was a discussion of grassroots action, and this being really something that is valuable, but one that can have its greatest impact when it's targeted and strategic. So while we might want everybody to agree or for public opinion on climate to be the same, that really what we need here is strategic and targeted action around key decisions and around key policies. And you might find an example of this in the recent US elections, where very targeted action in particular swing states really made a difference. And one of the speakers, Richard Florizone, really spoke to the distributed nature of the problem and how that really creates an opportunity for new kinds of partnerships, including those between, perhaps what we might call unlikely allies, those that we wouldn't necessarily finding at the table together. And he pointed specifically to the opportunity for partnerships around climate finance and the opportunity for climate finance to play an even bigger role in climate solutions going forward. And both in this domain, in the finance world, and more broadly, particularly around adaptation, that this is really something that we can look to other parts of the world, not just the sort of the West and the North, but also the global South, in drawing examples and lessons from. And just to end, Ted Parson really talked about the balance between the incremental change being something that we shouldn't toss out as being valuable, that it's something that is positive and something that we should pursue, but not so much that it doesn't create a detriment to the bigger transformational changes that we're really looking for. So we need both incremental change, we need transformational change, and we need them both slow and fast to occur. And finally, Ted Parson also made who's an advocate for geoengineering, really said, look, this is one of the solutions that is likely to emerge out of the dual crisis of climate and democracy. And instead of, putting our heads in the sand and saying, well, we don't really want this to happen, we should really start to prepare for it and think about, what that will involve in really reshaping that kind of hockey stick that we see on climate emissions. Thanks.
Thanks, Christy. That's fascinating. Let me now turn to a session that we ran at the Victoria Forum this time, for the first time, in French, on the role of universities to bridge divides and the socioeconomic and environmental divisions. This session was organized in collaboration with the Agence Universitaire de Francophonie, and I'm pleased to call on the rector, Slim Khabous, to make some comments. I believe he will be speaking in French, and then Dr. Delgatouni will be helping us with the translation into English. So, Rector Khabous.
Thank you.
Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Let me speak in French, please. Alors, merci beaucoup à l'Université de Victoria de nous permettre de co-organiser ensemble ce panel qui a été très intéressant. Je voudrais remercier Madame la sénatrice Joseph Forest-Niessing pour son résumé et les participants. On avait 2 ministres de l'enseignement supérieur du pays du Congo et de la Mauritanie. On avait 2 chefs d'entreprise du Canada, d'Europe, et on avait 4 présidents d'universités venant de plusieurs pays, Roumanie, Canada, Haïti, Antilles. Donc, ça a été un panel très international et très intéressant. Le titre du panel, c'était « Le rôle des universités pour combler les clivages et les fractures socio-économiques et environnementales qui découleront de la pandémie ». Je dirais que la conclusion principale à retenir du débat était la suivante. L'apport et l'impact de l'université sur les solutions aux fractures socio-économiques et environnementales passe principalement par la convergence et l'interconnexion des positions et des actions de 3 catégories d'acteurs, à savoir les universitaires, les politiques et l'écosystème. La table ronde est sortie avec une matrice présentant 4 recommandations, et chaque recommandation est déclinée pour les universités, pour les politiques et pour l'écosystème. La première recommandation est liée à l'accès à l'enseignement supérieur et plus particulièrement à l'enseignement à distance de qualité. L'objectif est de comment démocratiser le numérique. Pour les universités, c'est d'abord de poursuivre le développement des formations en ligne de qualité, contenu, formation des formateurs, sensibilisation des étudiants, etc. Pour les politiques, c'est essentiellement de généraliser l'infrastructure numérique, qui dans beaucoup de pays du Sud est l'handicap principal pour le développement du numérique. Et donc, il faut une prise de conscience politique. Pour l'écosystème, il s'agit de généraliser le marché. Il s'agit de pousser les entreprises à distribuer plus de services Internet et à ne pas hésiter à prendre des risques pour innover dans le développement du nouvel environnement numérique parce que c'est eux qui vont créer le besoin et le marché. Deuxième recommandation, au niveau de la formation des ressources humaines. L'objectif est que les professionnels et les dirigeants de demain possèdent des connaissances et des compétences multiples afin de pouvoir mieux conjuguer les exigences de la société post-pandémie. Beaucoup de nouveaux programmes doivent être offerts par l'université, des programmes de formation interdisciplinaires et intersectoriels, éviter le cloisonnement des disciplines. Pour les politiques, mieux exprimer les besoins des États en compétences et soutenir financièrement le développement des programmes favorisant l'interdisciplinarité. Pour l'écosystème et les entreprises, mieux exprimer les besoins des opérateurs socio-économiques en compétences. Participer à la formation en offrant des services pratiques tels que les stages et les portes ouvertes et recourir davantage aux universités en matière de formation continue. Troisième recommandation, recherche et développement. L'objectif est d'accélérer la recherche et développement dans les secteurs à prioriser au lendemain de la pandémie. Aujourd'hui, tous les pays revoient leurs priorités, environnement, santé, technologie numérique, et sont à prioriser. L'université doit mettre en place les mécanismes de reconnaissance et d'incitation pour faciliter la collaboration, favoriser la recherche-action, la recherche appliquée, la recherche à impact sociétal, plutôt que la recherche fondamentale. Pour la politique, reconnaître la recherche et l'innovation académique comme une ressource économique stratégique et pas seulement comme une formation sociale, accroître le soutien financier pour la recherche universitaire dans les domaines identifiés comme prioritaires, et cela n'est pas toujours évident dans tous les pays. L'écosystème, accroître le partenariat avec le milieu universitaire en offrant par exemple davantage d'applications concrètes aux jeunes chercheurs en entreprise. Financer de la recherche en entreprise doit être généralisé pour l'ensemble des jeunes chercheurs. Quatrième et dernier point de recommandation, c'est au niveau des services à la collectivité ou à la société. L'objectif, c'est d'identifier les mécanismes et le dialogue multipartis, multi-acteurs, universités, politique, écosystème, en vue d'accélérer le développement des innovations nécessaires. Et c'est vraiment la conjugaison des trois acteurs qui peut donner de l'innovation. Plus de prospection et d'ouverture sur l'environnement, plus l'université doit être plus branchée sur les besoins exprimés par la société aujourd'hui, suivre l'évolution incroyable que la société suit aujourd'hui. Le politique il doit considérer et promouvoir l'université comme un acteur essentiel et majeur de l'innovation, valoriser l'université auprès des acteurs socio-économiques. C'est un rôle important dans beaucoup de pays où l'université reste secondaire, reste fermée sur elle-même. Et puis, enfin, l'écosystème, identifier le mode de dialogue avec les universités pour faire connaître les nouveaux besoins en matière de recherche et développement et d'innovation. Voilà, j'espère qu'on n'a pas avoir été très long, mais l'idée, c'est une meilleure articulation entre l'apport de chacun pour que l'université soit au centre du développement que nous suivons après cette série de crises et de pandémies que nous vivons. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Recteur. It is my pleasure and honor to translate to you some of these recommendations. But before I do that, I would like to commend the leadership role of the champion. So, the Vice Rector Alain
Charbonneau.
Charbonneau, sorry. I'm looking for my words as I'm trying to translate. So for Alain Charbonneau and the Rector Slim Khalboustos, thank you very much for the partnership. To be true to the to what the Rector has just said, the session that was organized had an eclectic and very interesting composition with a senator representing the Senate of Canada, 2 ministers from Africa, Congo and Mauritania, 2 executives of businesses, and 4 presidents of universities coming from different corners of the world. And I'm happy to mention those later on. So the discussion was very intensive and addressed a number of questions that was moderated by a professional journalist. But what the rector just said is the conclusion from that conversation is this translation from what he said is that the contribution and the impact of the university on solution to socioeconomic and environmental divides mainly go through the convergence and interconnectedness of the positions and actions of three categories of actors. And these actors are the academia, the politicians, and the ecosystem. And then he went on to present a matrix that is very interesting from the way how they structure it in terms of recommendations and actors. And as you can see, there are the recommendations in the first column, and then the three categories of actors. So the universities themselves, the politics or the public authorities, and the ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, we include also the economic actors, the enterprises, and in that. So there are a number of recommendations that I will go through very quickly. So the first one is to ensure access to quality distance university education. And basically based on the conversation and the experience of the COVID-19 and the expansion of the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, now it is possible to reach people in different places. So for the university is to continue the development of quality online training. And that means that development of equipment, development of content, equipment, and training the teachers or and students and university staffs to deliver content online. For the politics is more around building the infrastructure and making sure that there is a better connectivities around the world. And for the ecosystem is to allow people to access to internet services, especially high speed throughout different countries, and also taking risk because it's really there where you can see the innovation. The second recommendation is about human resource training, and that is professionals and leaders of tomorrow. They have this kind of multiplicity of knowledge, so not really just the going deep and being specialized, but also developing the skills to be able to understand the multifaceted wicked problems that we are facing as society. In terms of what the university has to do is really to develop more and more interdisciplinary training and intersectoral programs responding to the new needs of society. What the politics has to do is to better express the needs of the state in terms of skills and financial support to develop such programs and promoting interdisciplinary approach to developing the incentives in this regard. And in terms of the ecosystem around the universities is to better express the needs of socioeconomic operators in terms of skills and participate in the training, offering practical services such as internships and so on, and make greater use of universities in the area of continuing education. The two others recommendations are around research and development. So it is really encouraging research in priority areas in the aftermath of the pandemic, the environment, the health, the digital technology. For universities, set up recognition mechanisms and incentives to facilitate collaboration in this regard and promote action research, applied research, and research with societal impact. For the politics, it's really to recognize economic research and innovation as a strategic economic resource, and that is around the world, and increase the financial support to universities in areas that are identified that are bridging the divides, those environment and those priority areas, environment, health, and digital technology. And in terms of the ecosystem, it is really to increase the partnerships and how to work with the university and commission more universities and laboratories for innovation with a mission to seek solution to these challenges. In terms of services to the community, so what this panel and this roundtable found is that there should be intensification of multi-party dialogue mechanisms. So how, and Victoria Forum is one of the examples here where we're trying to bridge that divide and create opportunities for university policymakers and the ecosystem to have conversation in order to accelerate the development of the necessary innovations. In terms of actions for the university or recommendations for the university, it's more prospecting and opening up the environment. And there are a number of actions proposed there. And for the politics, it's to consider and promote university as an essential and major player in innovation, and how the university becomes more and more integrated into the community and into the social and economic fabric. And in terms of the enterprise, it is the accelerating and intensifying the dialogue with the university to promote awareness and new research and development solution. I think this is, and as you can see, these are not just pertinent recommendations to Francophone university, but to all universities around the world. Thank you very much for that excellent conversation and recommendations. Over to you, Saul.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Adele, and thank you for the rector for those comments. One of the key themes of the Victoria Forum was also around bridging economic divides. The pandemic has certainly exacerbated and widened the divides that existed in the past. So one of the sessions we had was on enhancing financial inclusion, which was broken up into two subsessions, one looking at open banking as a solution for financial inclusion in Canada, and the other one on the role of fintech in cross-border remittances for poverty alleviation and micro investments in developing countries. Senator Wan Pa-Wu was the moderator for both of those sessions. So, Senator Wu, could I turn it over to you for a few minutes, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Saul, and good day to everyone. I wasn't able to join much of the previous discussion, but I understand that you'd like me to provide a bit of a summary of our deliberations, focusing perhaps on recommendations, if that's correct. I see you nodding. Yeah, let me just extemporize here. I don't have prepared notes, but starting with the open banking session first, and then going on to the remittances discussion. The open banking discussion focused principally on Canada, but kept its eye very much on financial inclusion in the Canadian context, because while the problems of financial inclusion within Canada are not the same as those in developing countries, Canada does have a segment of the population that does not have as good access to financial products and services that the better well-heeled, the more well-capitalized, and the more established sectors of society have. I'm referring principally to loans for startup operations on the part of entrepreneurs who do not have credit records that the traditional institutions are willing to accept and to provide financing for. So these are relatively small loans, but they are essential both for economic survival, particularly in the time of COVID, but also for innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic growth. Canada, generally speaking, is a bit of a laggard when it comes to open banking, and this session, which featured 4 very distinguished panelists, was able to give us some ideas on how to advance open banking and hence financial inclusion in this country. The principal recommendation, if my memory serves me correctly, is really around data and the ability of consumers to use and to have access to the data and to make it available to other providers of financial instruments in a way that, of course, is secure and which respects competition among the different financial providers. That data currently is, as you can imagine, controlled by the incumbents, the big institutions. And in order for this data to be liberated, if you will, there will have to be an open banking framework that, on the one hand, allows for more competition, on the other hand, provides for data privacy and security. There are, as many of you know, there are technologies, what they call APIs, that can scrape data to enable other financial providers to use this information and to reach borrowers and other users in a way that the big banks simply either have no interest in reaching or are unable to reach for other reasons. There was a nice connection in that session with one of our panelists, the governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia, where he talked about the role of fintechs in Tunisia and how the central bank is advocating experimentation in fintechs to improve financial inclusion in his country. And that was very refreshing to hear, because central banks are typically very conservative and tend to put the brakes on financial innovation that is even remotely risky. But the governor is very proactive in trying to promote innovation and has set up, or he told us about what he called a fintech sandbox in Tunisia that is developing instruments that will create better access to financial tools for the citizens of that country. Moving on to the second part of our discussion on financial inclusion, we narrowed the focus on what we called small cross-border money transfers, also known as remittances, and the role that they play in terms of broadly poverty alleviation, but also financial inclusion in the recipient countries. Again, we had terrific speakers, experts on fintech in developing countries, experts on remittances, experts on payments processes. We learned about some very interesting experiments, much more than experiments now, interesting initiatives going on. In particular, we heard from a colleague in Peru who described that out of the 10 million unbanked people in Peru, his initiative has been successful in bringing, I believe it's 1 million of the 10 million unbanked into a situation where they can access financial products, in essence, to do transactions using just their phone without having a bank account, and yet being able to access cash when needed. There are other projects in other parts of the world, in East Africa, in South Asia, lots of course in throughout China and other parts of Southeast Asia. But this example was very heartening. We then narrowed the focus even further on cross-border transfers, i.e. remittances, and discussed some of the challenges that are being faced. The first thing we were reminded of was how material remittances are in the global development space. We were reminded that global remittances, even though they fell this year because of COVID, global remittances are larger, in aggregate larger than foreign direct investment, I believe, and larger than ODA, official development assistance. So there's a great imperative to make remittances operate not only more smoothly, but also at lower cost, because needless to say, the people who are sending and receiving, particularly when we're talking about migrant workers, these are relatively small sums of money, and the higher the transaction costs, the lesser the benefit that goes to the recipients. And so then the discussion basically went into the area of how do we reduce transaction costs, and it's really all about, number one, standards, whether we can harmonize different standards for payments processing, because different countries have different rules around what needs to be done when money arrives, and those all add costs to the transfers. So we talked about whether there was a possibility of some kind of an open architecture platform which different payment systems could use, so that the transaction costs could be significantly reduced. And then we talked about the difference between private providers and not-for-profit profit providers, and whether we could scale up some of these not-for-profit ventures so that they could be used more widely, so that transaction costs go down and the benefits of remittances go up. That's my off the top of my head summary. Obviously, if others participated, be happy to hear their input as well. Back to you, Saul.
That's great. Thank you very much, Senator. Certainly, when we started thinking about the Victoria Forum, one of the issues that we were looking at was lenses that we would look at the issues, and particularly turf, trust, and truth. When we talk about truth, social media obviously comes to the forefront. And we had a session that Janai Aragon was championing, Bridging Social Divides, Pandemic Politics and Social Media, in the context of the 2020 elections. Janai?
Thanks, Saul. Really appreciate it to be included in this amazing event. And as I listen to my colleagues, one of the things that I keep on hearing is the importance for conversation. I've also heard themes of inclusion, empathy, and values. And this is definitely something that we spoke to in the session that I was involved with, one of my colleagues from sociology, Dr. Ed Hodge, as well as two of our fantastic students, Tanner Lawrenson and Jasmine Pathak. And, Ed was really coming at it from his expertise with fringe groups, conservatism, that sort of thing. And I was coming with my political science lens, looking at social media and the ways in which so many people, including myself, live within our echo chambers. And I'm thinking of one of the things that Ed said is that we need to ensure that we get out of our echo chambers and consume multiple media resources. And here we're talking about bona fide journalists, with media sources that are more legitimate and not fringe. So this might be going to Al Jazeera English, BBC News, the Globe and Mail, et cetera, and not just merely consuming from Rebel Media in Canada, or just the Murdoch enterprises in the US or elsewhere for that matter. So continued conversation was definitely part of what we discussed, as well as understanding that the rage we see, the responses, be it American rage with the election, stems from fear, discussions of empathy, lack thereof, values, as well as conversations about inclusion and the importance of it. So I'll just end there. Again, thank you so much for including me with this fantastic conversation, and I do look forward to the reports.
Great. Thanks, Janai. So one of the things that we've seen over 2020 is we've been all asked to change our behavior. There was a really interesting session that Marieka Schumacher was championed on 2020, the year of behavioral science and social relations. Marieka, do you want to give us some insights from that session?
I would love to. Thank you so much. And I will share my screen so that you can see what I'm talking about. Because at first, of course, it might have seemed like a slightly left field suggestion that 2020 was the year of behavioral science. But when you think about it, it becomes pretty clear why that is the case. We were all fighting a global pandemic, and the only tool at our disposal, anyone's disposal, really still until now, is to ask people to change their behavior. So this session brought together a fantastic group of speakers. You'll see the names on the slide. And we learned really three things of what 2020 and socials and behavioral science and social relations have in common. The first thing that we learned was that a pandemic is truly not a medical issue alone. A pandemic is a social, a political, an economic, a coordination and collaboration issue. A pandemic is an issue of trust, of information, of knowledge. We've heard that already many times today. A pandemic is also an issue of the ability to talk to each other and to be heard by each other. And a pandemic is also an issue of the understanding of just how much the mental constraints that humans have interfere with our ability to plan for and to respond to shocks. And that is why it became very clear throughout this discussion that actually we now know behavioral science needs to be an integral part of everything that we do. And this session was very much focused on this idea of how behavioral science can start infusing maybe other issues and being used in other contexts. So the other points were that, of course, humans always matter. And we can't forget about humans. They need to be part of even the most abstract political discussions. And the third point that came through in many different ways, of course, the summary is in my words, but the panelists talked about this in many ways, is that the ways engaging internationally are really no longer fit for purpose, or maybe really they never were. And one really gaping example of why we need new ways of working is when it comes to knowledge. And again, we've heard this already a few times. I just want to give you this example here. You can see here on this image the world map scale to population. Now, it's very clear, of course, that research is done all over the world. Let's move to the world map scaled to published research. And all of a sudden, the gaping hole of knowledge becomes really clear. And when it comes to research, this is even exacerbated at the moment because we know that a lot of the research that is happening in the global north, as you see in Europe and North America, is pharmaceutical research. We lack a lot of the nuances. We lack a lot of insights into human behavior and how it plays out in different cultures and different contexts. And so from that, we moved on to identifying 8 dimensions, and I'm not going to spell them out to save some time, but you can see how actually these considerations of what are these new behaviorally informed ways of working for an international collaboration that works differently from our past, what these dimensions entail. And I would love for you to have a look at them. And if you are happy to further discuss, please get in touch with me. So from these 8 dimensions that came through in the discussion in various ways, one of the panelists, Jonathan Papolidis, extracted actually a couple of recommendations very directly addressed to the Senate of Canada. And so I thought, well, let's make use of the wonderful relationship that the Victoria Forum has with the Senate of Canada and use these recommendations. So you can see them here on the slides. I'll sum them up quickly. The Canadian government, the Senate of Canada, are very well placed in their existing policies to conduct a study or even hearings on what it would mean to support interdisciplinary development of these new ways of working, of which the dimensions you have just seen. It would fit very well into the international existence strategy as it exists right now by supporting efforts to these new ways of working. It would be a support to innovation, and the innovation being to put humans center stage, even in seemingly high-level political discussions and institutional engagements. And it could catalyze Canadian leadership to help bridge divides and support resilience in even the most fragile regions of the world, but really the regions of the world and where simply most people live. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marieke. Continuing on pretty much a very similar theme, we have a session on moving beyond divides towards a more sustainable and fairer future for local communities and the global community. It was co-championed by Manuel Balan and Elisar Saru. Manuel, are you want to talk to this one? Or Elisar? I'm not sure which of you wanted to talk to this.
This is Elisar. Manuel was here earlier and he had to leave.
Okay.
So what he said that he would send a written statement, but I could share with you the main themes that really discussed in that session. And then he will send a written statement with a recommendation. Would that work?
That would be great.
Okay. So this was a workshop that put together by professors of practice from the Institute on the Study of International Development at McGill University and moderated by the acting director of the Institute. And the theme was, to focus on beyond divides. So the first point of discussion that launched this workshop was an issue of racism and other structural inequalities that have been intensified and accentuated with COVID. And there was some examples that were discussed, and one was the American lobster fishery dispute and other systemic racism in Canadian institutions and cultural institutions. So those were discussed, and some examples given on the responses that these situations was dealt with. And in the course of the discussion, that this gives hope that the response was quite, could have been more previously expected, but there is room and lots of work is needed in this area. The other theme that also really highlighted in this workshop was sorry, I'm having problems with my screen keeps getting blank. So the other one was that we need emergency response framework that is inclusive, and there is a need that to capture the strength that is embedded in local communities. So communities have been local communities that is, have been taking the brunt of the impact of COVID, and they have been, showing systems of resilience in supporting one another. So the focus here was, so I really apologize. My system keeps, my computer keeps turning black screen, and I can't, the notes were handed from Manuel, so I'm sorry about that. If you can, maybe accommodate somebody else until I fix this problem, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Elisar. We also looked at as I said at the outset, what was happening in the shadow of the US elections, and particularly with two regional foci. Unfortunately, we don't have the champion available to talk on the impact of the US elections on change of continuity in global affairs in Asia, but we do have a champion for the session on bridging divides in the Middle East and GCC region, the ripple effects of the US elections on the divides of the Middle East. That was co-championed by Abdul Fattah Mohammed and Yasser Doob. Yasser, I believe you're going to make some comments on that?
Hi, Saul. How are you? Hi, everyone. Good. So basically, I think with the roundtable was based on important, I would say, an election, the U.S. election divide on its impact on the region of the Middle East and the GCC, regarding of course, with the legacy of a Trump era and how a Biden administration would really impact the coming 4 years, actually. So we, with the different participants, actually, they have really added, and I would really thank them all. Most of all, I thank Senator Manson, who graciously moderated the debate on Roundtable, and actually was really very enriching, I would say. So the impact of a prospective Biden administration in that region is, I would say, important. due to the fact that the Trump era, unfortunately, has, I would say, destroyed the basic tenets of the American U.S. Policies there in terms of multilateral actually policies in regard of United Nations resolution on how NATO can really be as an important partner in that region, how let's say the different the different institutions that are there in that region. So we within the idea of bridging divides, what is really a perspective Biden administration can really hasten or enhances the prospect of more harmonized, I would say, Middle East and GCC country. As the participants have said, of course, there is three basic, unfortunately, important tenets. One of them, of course, that the Palestinian cause, that the Palestinian question that was unfortunately put aside in terms of the recent outreach that was made by Israel and the rest of the important country in the region, basically, namely UAE and Bahrain. So I'm talking about that outreach has succeeded actually to create a new era or a new reality. In theory, it's very interesting, by the way, because actually it gives the region a very important prospect, either in the economical aspect or in the political aspect. But unfortunately, as some of the participants have said, we still have the core issue of that the Middle East not really resolved, actually. So, which is namely the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian-Israeli question that's not really is still not really settled. So, as I said, also in the and I phrased the issue, it's very important that you create the outreach, but you have really to start with your closest neighbor. So, if what is really the rationale of that outreach, a peaceful outreach between the rest of the Arab world, if the Palestinian-Israeli issue is not resolve it, if we as a neighbor we're not really reaching that settlement. I've discussed it, and one of the panels have discussed, of course, of the elderly, unfortunately, leaders of Palestine and Israel. Maybe there is a new prospect of new leadership both in Israel and Palestine that were actually that would really lead, let's say, the way of new peaceful treaties or peaceful important steps. I think that the Biden administration can do something, at least for that regard, actually. Okay. With regard to the GCC region, I would say actually there is the core issue also of the Qatar invasion, that the GCC is, as an institution, is still not really resolved. I think that the Biden administration can really succeed, at least to make that institution work in harmony, at least, or be a stabilizing force for the region. Again, also the war of Yemen have to be stopped. Bridging divides, of course, it's very important that we have to focus on women empowerment, on education. These can be actually factors of bridging divides, of creating new venues for peaceful settlement or harmony in the region. Yes, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Yasser. Fascinating. We unfortunately don't have time to go back to Alisar, and the other session we don't have a champion here for today was on the future of business and the nature of management education. But we do have two final speakers who will give some brief reflections and some summary comments. Let me turn first to Khalil Sharif. Khalil, over to you for 2 minutes.
Khalil left, sorry.
Oh, sorry. In which case, we'll go straight to Senator Munson. Jim? Is Senator Munson still with us?
Well, good. That'll give me 4 minutes. That's wonderful. This has been, once again, this has been so fascinating, and this partnership between the Senate of Canada, the University of Victoria, and the Victoria Forum, like a new day is dawning in terms of partnerships between academia and politicians. We like to think of ourselves in the Senate of Canada as the original think tank, and some would call us the Chamber of Sober Second Thought. And I was struck by Lord Alderdice and his opening remarks on talking about we have to keep at center. This is just not academia talk. It's profoundly human challenges. And we just heard it with Marika just moments ago about the center of humans. And when we were talking with Yasser moments ago about the Middle East and the Gulf, at the center for me is the plight of refugees in Yemen and the issue of water advisories in our own country called Canada on Indigenous lands. Can you imagine? We're having that. And this is about the center of humans at the focus of what we're all talking about. I really want to thank Abdullah Fattah Mohammed and Yasser moments ago as a moderator of that particular session. It was really a very enriching conversation, and every conversation was enriching. I think that we learned from each other, and I think what we have to take away from here is to understand that the ideas that we do have, the center of them, we can influence governments around the world, the Canadian government and any other government and other organizations. So I'd just like to end with this thought that the forum is really a unique partnership between the University of Victoria and the Senate of Canada. And it's our mission to try to bridge divides, economic divides, social divides, and environmental divides. As we know, fed by evidence-based knowledge and insights from around the world, this forum aims to provide a roadmap to recovery and contribute to the development of a better, diverse world. What I liked the most, of course, was this summer and fall, the webinars and the senators involved in each of these webinars and then involved in the main session itself. They really shed light on the experiences of people and contributed to deeper appreciation of issues and pathways to solutions. As I mentioned, I enjoyed being a moderator. I know the senators enjoyed being a moderator. We have to keep this up and going. I think it's important for this country, and I think it's important around the world. And for you, scholars and members of important networks of research and influence, the ideas that you generated during the session, they really do deepen our understanding of the situations, not only in the Middle East and the region, but on climate change, academia, diversity. It just goes on. And we do spread important threads of solutions to bridging divides. I think I should leave it at that because I know time is of the essence, but humans, we just heard it, center stage at all of this and what we do. And let's keep bridging our own. We don't have divides anymore with this group. We've crossed that bridge, haven't we? And I think that's a good bridge to cross. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Senator. We really deeply appreciate all of your help in making the partnership with the Senate come together and your involvement in the Victoria Forum from the beginning. To all of our participants, we will be asking you for feedback, getting some sense of what worked for you, what we could work to improve as we go forward. This is not the end of a discussion. And certainly, as we've heard from all of the panelists, these are very broad, far-ranging issues that we all have to deal with. So I want to thank all of our participants for coming. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Horbaczewski to make some closing comments, but I also just wanted to acknowledge and send our condolences to Hakim El-Haiti, who participated in the forum in the opening plenary despite the very tragic personal circumstances that she was facing. With that, let me call on Chris. Chris Horbaczewski is the Vice President of External Relations for the University of Victoria to provide some closing comments on behalf of the university. So from me, thank you all, and we look forward to continue the discussion. Chris?
Thank you very much, Saul, and thank you, Senator Munson, for your closing comments as well, and thank you to all of the participants today. I'm delighted to join you in closing this virtual Victoria Forum, Bridging Divides in the Wake of a Global Pandemic. It has been a great honor for the university to co-host this innovative event in partnership with the Senate of Canada. What I would like to do is begin by recognizing and once again thanking our founding sponsors, TELUS and Band City, for their commitment and support of the Victoria Forum. To say 2020 has been unique for all of us is perhaps a bit of an understatement. Given this, though, the themes of the Victoria Forum and the many conversations we've had during the sessions are more important than ever. The divides we have in our society are significant, and we have been made more acutely aware of those divides as a result of the global pandemic. Through the plenary sessions and the roundtable presentations, leaders of our community and of communities around the globe have shared their knowledge and insights about the long-term impact of the pandemic on economic, social, and environmental issues. They have challenged us to explore how we respond and develop solutions. The University of Victoria is one of the leading research-intensive universities in Canada, with considerable expertise, research capacity, and innovative ideas to offer as we collectively strive to create the solutions to the urgent challenges the pandemic presents. On behalf of the Victoria Forum and the University of Victoria, I would like to thank the Senate and Speaker Fury for their partnership. I would also like to thank the many speakers and champions for engaging with us on important discussions on sustainability, civic leadership, Indigenous knowledge, and in building a resilient and strong future for our youth. I want to thank all of our participants. It's your ideas and contributions that help shape our local and global communities. I'd also like to extend all of our gratitude to our chair, Dean Saul Klein, and co-chairs, Dr. Adele Gutuni and Ambassador Sebastian Beaulieu, for their invaluable contributions. And finally, I want to recognize, acknowledge, and thank Annie Buck, the Victoria Forum Manager, along with the teams from the Gustafson School of Business, External Relations at the University of Victoria, and of course, staff within the Senate of Canada that helped organize the Victoria Forum from behind the scenes. We have laid some terrific foundations for the 2021 Victoria Forum and all of the events leading to it. With good fortune and science on our side, we look forward to welcoming all of you to Victoria at this time next year. Again, thank you and have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world.
And thank you, everyone. And that concludes our virtual Victoria Forum for 2020. Be safe.